Okay, students, so today I'm coming to teach you about iris atrophy. So pay particular attention so that anytime you identify the iris being atrophic, you can easily make it out and take decisions. So here you are. This is the normal iris. Look at how brownish it appears, all right? So it's just this is the normal iris that you see. Now let's delve more into iris atrophy. You see some whitish material, great whitish material, which are found within the iris. These are the features that make the iris become atrophic. Those are the features here. You can find the features over here too, making the iris become what atrophic. So these are the grayish whitish material that make the iris become what atrophic. Now look at the normal iris again, and then look at the atrophic iris. Look at here, it's gray white, gray whitish, gray whitish, gray whitish. So that makes the iris what atrophic. You have more pictures here. This is atrophic iris or iris atrophy. Iris atrophy, those are the features that make the iris become what atrophic. Another example here, look at all this gray whitish uh, appearance of the iris superiorly, so that makes the iris what atrophic. Okay, another picture is here. This time around is at this particular portion, this iris atrophy. And the characteristic of iris atrophy is that you have this whitish grayish appearance of the coloration of the iris. That makes the iris become what atrophic. So until you find this, you can't say the iris is atrophic. But once you find gray whitish material within the iris, then you call it what iris atrophy. Now look at the cause or etiology of iris atrophy. Sometimes the cause is unknown, that is essential. Other times it is caused by surgeons or iatrogenic when the surgeon spends so much time in theater manipulating the iris. It can be a cause of iris what atrophy. So we call it what iatrogenic cause. It can also be as a result of injury or trauma to the iris. Okay. Another cause is inflammation within the eye. We will delve more into that, just like increase intraocular pressure causing iris atrophy and then ischemia. For the very last three, we'll delve a bit more into that. But if you are asked to mention the cause of iris atrophy, don't hesitate to mention idiopathic. Okay, in fact, all of them start with I. Okay, idiopathic meaning essential, iatrogenic. So iris start with I. So the causes also start with I. So idiopathic, that is essential, iatrogenic, injury to the trauma or trauma to the iris, that is I. Inflammation is I. Increase in blood pressure is I, and ischemia starts with I. So iris starts with I, and the cause of iris atrophy, all of them start with what? I. So let's delve more into the inflammatory cause. It can be caused by herpes simplex and herpes zoster inflammations within the eyeball. But then typically when you have herpes simplex inflammation within the eyeball, it causes what we call the sectorial atrophy. Again, you have some types of uveitis like fixed uveitis which can cause iris atrophy, and of course post-Naegeli syndrome which can cause iris atrophy. Now let's look at increase intraocular pressure or glaucoma causes of iris atrophy. So it may come as a result of post-angle closure glaucoma, giving what we call spiral atrophy. It can also come as a result of what iridocorneal endothelial syndrome. In that case, you have scattered atrophy of the iris with correctopia and pseudopolychoria. When we talk about correctopia, it means that the geometric center of the iris where pupil must be placed is not over there anymore. The pupil has been placed outside the geometric center of the iris. That's known as what correctopia. We told you what the atrophy is. In this sense, it is scattered. And of course, there's pseudopolychoria. Pseudo because they are false. The iris has several holes in them, but these are not proper pupils, so we call them pseudo, and they are many, so we call them pseudopolychoria. So pupils that are found within the iris, multiple of them, but they are false, so that's why they are called pseudopolychoria. Now, another important etiology under the increased pressure in the eye cause of iris atrophy is pigment dispersion syndrome, which gives way to atrophy at the peripheral portion of the iris. The last but not the least cause of the increase in intraocular pressure is pseudo-exfoliation syndrome, in which case there is dandruff-like flake-like material deposited on the surface of the crystalline lens in the aqueous humor and then at the angle bringing about increased pressure in the eye. So that is characterized by atrophy at the peripheral border. So its chemical cause is basically is one, and that is called by what? Anterior segment ischemia. Now, let's look at typical examples and how they appear. When it is caused by herpes simplex, I mean, when the iris atrophy is caused by herpes simplex, the appearance is quite sectorial. It forms at one sector of the iris. That's why it's called sectorial. So when you see iris atrophy, which is sectorial or which has affected only one sector of the iris, you think about herpes simplex inflammatory cause. Now, let's give you another example here. You can realize that this particular picture of iris atrophy just affects one sector of the iris. So when you see that, the major etiology here is herpes simplex iris atrophy. Now, another one is when you see the picture like this and you are talking about eudoconia endothelial syndrome, what are the features? One, you have diffuse iris atrophy. There is correctopia because the pupil is found outside the geometric center of the iris, and you have pseudopolychoria because you have several holes within the iris which appear as though they are pupils, but they are not pupils. That's why they are called false pupils or pseudo. Okay, and many of them, so we call them pseudopolychoria. Correctopia is here because the pupil is found outside the geometric center of the iris, and then you have diffuse iris atrophy. These are the three major features which, when they come together, they give what you call eudoconia endothelial syndrome, which is a major cause of iris atrophy. Another example here is what you see here. This is correctopia because the center of the pupil displays outside the geometric center of the iris, and of course you find several holes within the iris. They appear as though they are pupils, but they are not. They are holes, and so that is why, and there are plenty of them. We call them pseudopolychoria. So for them to come together, we have three features. That's the diffuse atrophy within the iris. These are features of atrophy here, features of atrophy there, and you have pseudopolychoria because there are several holes within the iris, and of course the correctopia, which is the pupil displaced outside the geometric center of the iris is over here. Another example of iridocorneal endothelial syndrome is you have the correctopia, in which case the pupil is displaced outside the geometric center of the iris. There is what? Diffuse iris atrophy. There's iris atrophy here diffusely found at several points, and you have what? Pseudopolychoria. These are the three features that when you come to see them together, you have no other option but to diagnose endocorneal endothelial syndrome, which is a major cause of iris atrophy. And then the last but not the least cause or etiology is pseudoexfoliation syndrome. And what is a pseudoexfoliation syndrome? You have dandruff-like material being released and then being deposited on the surface of the crystalline lens, and sometimes within the aqueous and then on the iris, and then you have them too at the iris atrophy is basically at the pupillary border. Okay, so I bring this lecture to an end. Make sure that you go through your notes and then do what is expected of you, so I'll see you in class.